We've talked about all sorts of villains who've met defeat from studios like Pixar, Dreamworks, and even Illumination, but that does leave a few stragglers outside of the spotlight. With that, we've decided to take a whole bunch of the most noteworthy villains from other animated movie studios and rank their fates from the least gruesome to the ones who would have probably preferred some more Disney-esque fates. Let's begin with the villains who got off easy with mild consequences, or in some cases, pretty much no consequences at all. To fit that second description, we're kicking off this list with Warren T. Rat from Fievel Goes West, An American Tale. Warren's business venture is essentially extorting mice for protection money from cats, with the former being unaware that Warren's real name is Warren T. Cat, as in he's a cat. If I had a nickel for every time I saw a 1986 animated movie with a villain who has rat in his name but isn't a rat, I'd have 2 nickels, which I'm sure Warren would extort from me immediately. When Warren's identity is exposed to Fievel, Warren stops at nothing to kill him, even going as far as to try and burn down the pier so the mice can't escape after his plan to blackmail them out of all their money fails. Look, we've all seen Tom and Jerry. We all know cats are gonna chase mice, but it's one thing to try and catch a mouse for food, or even because it's what they're expected to do. It's another to commit literal arson to take them out as a petty form of revenge. While he does fail to get revenge, Warren also doesn't really get punished for his misdeeds. He and his gang just end up on a steamboat bound for Hong Kong. Not only does he have the hope of getting revenge on Fievel and the gang one day, but he takes comfort in the fact that Hong Kong has plenty of mice too. So the worst this guy got for his pure evil misdeeds was just doing them in a different place. No change, no growth, no punishment, literally just relocation.
I'll have to learn to calculate in Chinese.
Even this next guy had some change, though you could argue it was a good thing for Ryden the Moon King. In Kubo and the Two Strings, Ryden is a villain who's built up throughout the entire movie as a terrifying threat. He's a tyrannical, immortal overlord whose goal was to steal his own grandson's eyeballs so he could join their immortal night-ruling family. Man, what is it with Laika villains and mutilating children's eyes? In any case, Ryden was ultimately defeated by Kubo and reduced to a mortal man with no memory of who he was. So the people in Kubo's village told him he was a chill guy who loved his grandson and wouldn't even dream of trying to harvest his eyeballs. Going from immortal to mortal must be a difficult pill to swallow, is what I would say if Ryden had any memory of who he was.
But I don't remember.
As it is, basically, he got away with mass murder, slavery, and psychological terrorism, with his sole punishment being that he's now just a peaceful old man living with his grandson. Sounds like a pretty easy deal to me. Rounding out our bottom 3 is Miss Malcin from Leo, who is probably the least villainous villain on this list. While she seems like little more than a grouchy substitute at first, it turns out that Miss Malcin actually used to have dreams and a conscience. And being inspired by how Leo was able to get through to the students he went home with, she decided to abandon him in the woods and tell the kids he left them so she could take all the credit for their growth. Okay, a bit of a rough start to that redemption arc, but thanks to one of the most out-of-nowhere scenes I've ever witnessed in a movie, she feels convicted enough to admit to her wrongdoing, apologize to her students, and help them find Leo.
I wanted the credit.
In the end, she finally gets the teaching position she'd always dreamt of, leading to a happy ending where she keeps Squirtle and Leo on as class pets. The only downside of her ending is the fact that she's going to be teaching those Invader Zim-looking kindergartners, but aside from that, we'd say this is a fairly well-deserved happy ending for a woman who got dealt a pretty tough hand in life. If you're familiar with Wallace and Gromit, Feathers McGra is a baddie who needs no introduction. Despite being built like a bowling pin with eyes, this penguin is no joke. This mastermind jewel thief prefers working from the shadows and letting others unwittingly do his dirty work, usually by some very Plankton-esque forms of mind control. At the end of his debut appearance, The Wrong Trousers, Feather is imprisoned in a zoo as punishment for his crimes, often being mistreated by the guards and forced to do hard labor. But in Vengeance Most Foul, he did manage to escape and nearly steal the very same jewel Wallace and Gromit protected from him the first time, only to be tricked by Gromit at the last second, forced on the run yet again. Since Feathers is such a brilliant mind, we doubt he's going to be too stressed out by his current predicament. To him, running from authorities is like counting sheep, and this time he didn't even get jailed at the end of the movie. His lack of any real comeuppance at the end of Vengeance Most Foul leaves us itching to see this penguin purloiner finally get his just desserts. At the tail end of this first category is Rudy from Ice Age: Dawn of the Dinosaurs. Admittedly, this big guy is one of the least complicated villains on our list. He's literally just a wild animal trying to get food. A big boy's gotta eat after all. Thankfully, not every animal sees Rudy as just a monster. For Buck, he's an opponent who always provides a fun challenge.
Pop goes the weasel!
That explains why Buck was genuinely sad when he thought Rudy had fallen to his death during the final pursuit of Manny and the gang, only to realize the dinosaur inexplicably survived, and if his later cameos are anything to go off of, the two are still holding that legendary rivalry to this day. Some villains just get away with their crimes and remain the same person they used to be, or better in some cases, but others face more life-altering consequences. Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Ellingbow from Claws are first up in this category. Honestly, for a pair of hateful old bigots who literally forced their own families and friends to attack their neighbors for no reason aside from tradition, they pretty much got off scot-free. Like, is it going to be awkward for these mortal enemies to have their way of life changed and their children married to each other? Absolutely, but despite all the harm they cause, their literal worst punishment is the fact that it's no longer socially acceptable for them to hate each other. Well, that and the fact that their family is a perfect setup for a sitcom. It's gonna be an adjustment, sure, but given all the attempted murder and hate crimes they have under their belts, we'd say it's a lot more lenient than they deserve. From one Netflix movie to another, next up is Thelma the Unicorn's main villain, Vic Diamond. This talent scout is one of the smaller scale villains on our list. While he isn't good by any means, his worst attribute was really just him being manipulative and flaky with his clients. Granted, that did result in at least one attempted murder, but it's still pretty light compared to the rest of these bad guys. Vic's final scene was a desperate attempt to get Nikki back as a client after Thelma revealed her true self to the world, which was met with a reasonable blast of water from the former's blowhole. That was probably humiliating and painful, sure, but since this guy's rich and didn't do anything to warrant the authorities coming after him, we still say that he got off pretty easy, even if he might have trouble finding another client. Victor Quartain is up next. As one of the many members of Wallace & Gromit's rogues gallery, Victor has a lot to live up to. He may not be as sinister as a certain dead-eyed penguin, but Victor proved himself pretty unlikable over the course of Curse of the Were-Rabbit. Thankfully, his plans to con Lady Toddington out of her fortune and to kill Wallace would both fail miserably. After being thoroughly beaten by our heroes, Victor was shoved into a were-rabbit fursuit and handed over to an angry mob. As if being beaten up by a mob with torches and pitchforks weren't bad enough, even when Victor got that costume off, he'd still have some serious explaining to do and would probably end up taking some serious legal punishment as well. Now let's move from someone who's probably going to prison to someone who definitely is, Killian from Spies in Disguise. An international terrorist and former target of Lance Sterling, Killian dedicated his life to revenge on the spy after he killed his crew and disfigured him, forcing him to live with a robot arm and cyborg eye. I mean, like, at least you look cool, right?
You don't remember me, do you?
Well, sadly for Killian, he won't be looking cool outside of prison for a long time, and the only reason he was spared death was because Lance saved him during their final battle. Given the look on his face after being told this, we think there's honestly potential for Killian to be reformed. But then we remember that he's a mass murdering terrorist, and whatever good he does won't be outside the walls of a prison. Better than nothing, though. Up next, we have Mrs. Tweedy, who got about as painful of an end as a villain could without straight up dying. In the first chicken run, she suffered some serious blows, particularly being dropped into a pot of scalding hot gravy right before her factory blew up around her, leaving her to be crushed by the one door that was left standing. It's clear from that scene alone that Mrs. Tweedy has all the luck of Squidward from the classic SpongeBob episodes, but she not only survives this episode, she goes through an even more brutal one in the sequel. She gets shot with a robotic duck laser, which she wishes were an exaggeration, and was left at the center of a factory-sized explosion, only to be confirmed by the director to have inexplicably survived yet again. These cartoonishly brutal injuries are definitely painful for her to deal with, but she could technically just stop trying to commit acts of animal cruelty. Just a thought. In any case, let's round out this section with another Aardman/Dreamworks entry, the Toad. Being a speciesist crime lord who attempted a rodent-wide genocide, few villains on this list deserve to survive less than the Toad. Thankfully though, while he survived, he isn't gonna thrive. After being baited into getting his tongue stuck in a spinning gear, the Toad was trapped in place with his jaw wide open and his tongue forcibly extended for presumably hours before authorities eventually captured him off screen and threw him in prison. On top of dealing with some pretty intense physical pain for hours, he's being tried for literal genocide, which I'm pretty sure it's a life sentence anyway you slice it, at the very least. Unless Netflix decides they want a flushed away sequel, it's safe to say the Toad won't be seeing the outside of a prison cell ever again. But these next villains won't even be seeing that. For the first fatal section on our list, we have the instantaneous deaths. Sharptooth is another addition to the wild dinosaur villain category, but one who didn't get as lucky as Rudy in the end. Despite being a relatively normal T-Rex, which calls his villain status into question, Sharptooth is still a huge threat and the kind who holds grudges. He chases Littlefoot throughout the entire movie and tries to kill him through any means necessary as revenge for inadvertently scarring his eye. It takes the help of all Littlefoot's friends to defeat Sharptooth by dropping a giant boulder on his head from a high cliff. Even then, as Sharptooth falls into the waters below, presumably drowning, he almost manages to take Petrie with him, but Petrie has these neat little features called wings, which I'm guessing Sharptooth was pretty jealous of in his last moments. That scar must seem like a total non-issue right about now. The moment a wild animal can talk, we start to look at their morals a little more critically. Enter Soto from Ice Age, the first Blue Sky villain. This vicious predator wasn't the type to let his pride be wounded and take it lying down. If you mess with him or his tribe, Soto wouldn't stop at anything to hunt you down, not even attempting to murder an infant child. We all know the Ice Age baby is a demon from the depths of the netherworld, but that's still no excuse for infanticide. Thankfully, Soto's plans are thwarted by the literal last second when Soto's about to charge Sid and the baby. Manny comes in clutch by knocking him into an ice wall with his tusks, the impact causing several icicles to break loose and impale him to death instantly. Wow, that is ruthless for a kid's movie, and we're like barely halfway through all of these, so be prepared. The last death before things get really crazy in our final two categories is the director from Nimona. A devout follower of the age-old different equals bad philosophy, the director was as ruthless a leader as could be. She was paranoid to the point where any change in tradition was an offense punishable by death, and believe me, she would not hesitate to hand out that kind of punishment. She literally attempted to burn down half her kingdom with a laser just to ensure Nimona would die in the crossfire.
And so will the monster.
It's one thing to want to protect your kingdom, but if you're willing to straight up cut it in half to do so, I want to say that defeats the point. Thankfully, Nimona was willing to make her almost final moments heroic, transforming into a phoenix and kamikazeing herself into the director's cannon. You gotta respect the quick thinking Nimona used to transform into an immortal creature to take this tyrant down. And while the director's death was instantaneous, we're guessing the fact that there wasn't even a body after the fact means she's done for. Now let's move on to the characters who had to suffer a bit more after their misdeeds. These are the brutal demises. Kicking off this category is our final Aardman villain for the day, Queen Victoria from The Pirates, Band of Misfits, or if you're watching it over in the UK, An Adventure with Scientists. Of course, a more accurate title than both of these would be The Pirates Stop a Monarch from Feeding Their Parrot to a Cult of Rich Gourmet Poachers. Everybody needs a hobby, but there are definitely more pleasant ones to choose from than eating whatever endangered species you can get your grubby paws on, but unfortunately that's just the kind of thing this queen is into.
Just wait until you see what I've got for the main course.
Despite having her ship destroyed by the captain and his crew, Victoria almost managed to escape in a blimp, but thankfully for Polly, one self-defensive bite would spell the queen's doom. Polly ripped a hole in the blimp, causing Victoria to spiral out of control and ultimately find herself stranded on a deserted island full of some hungry, unhappy-looking endangered animals.
And with that, endangered was given a much newer, more unsavory meaning for Queen Victoria.
But I guess it's loosely possible that she could have survived, so we'll keep her placement right here. Up next, we have Madame Gasket from Robots, one of the most despicable villains on this list without a doubt. When you think about it, her plan to get rid of all the out modes and have them either forced to buy upgrades or die to become the upgrades is pretty much the robot equivalent of a human being forcing terminally ill people to either pay for expensive medical procedures or essentially be chopped up and have their parts redistributed to others.
It's either upgrade or the chop shop for you.
I say this so that when you see Madame Gasket being cast into a furnace, screaming as she's burnt alive and killed in a fiery explosion, you won't have to feel bad. If anything, it's satisfying to see her cast into the very same machine she used to kill countless others for the crime of being poor and or obsolete. Up next is our final Ice Age antagonist. Captain Gut was a ruthless pirate who had truly mastered the Seven Seas, at least by his own measuring stick. Unfortunately, for a guy who's supposedly such an expert on all things ocean, he fell for one of the most obvious tricks in the pirate book, a siren song. After being turned into a makeshift baseball by Manny, Gut survived just long enough to be lured in by a siren disguising itself as a female ape. By the time he realized it, Gut was seized by the shape-shifting spirit and eaten alive, with his last moments on screen being filled with screams of pain. It's the type of death a kid wouldn't think much about, but when you actually consider what happened to him, this was a pretty gruesome way to go. Perhaps the only Ice Age character with a crueler fate than that is Scrat, who's always kept just close enough to that unobtainable acorn to give him hope. Closing out this category is the real villain of Transformers 1, Sentinel Prime. This was the perfect example of a death that was both absolutely deserved and one that had us feeling genuinely bad for the victim, even just for a second. Like, Sentinel was pure evil, no doubt about it. The guy made a proverbial deal with the devil to gain his power, and when it came time to pay back his debts, he forced others to do the dirty work for him while he reaped all the benefits. All the deception and betrayal he inflicted on others was more than enough to warrant punishment, but when Megatron snapped, he decided to snap Sentinel along with him. Just partially off screen, we witness Megatron brutally ripping Sentinel Prime in half as he screams in pain. Screams only kept from my ears by the dramatic music. It's probably one of the most brutal scenes in any kids movie, honestly, and it's only kept from the top spot because Sentinel didn't have to suffer for too long. Plus, again, the guy absolutely deserved it. But we've saved the best for last, as per usual. These are the characters who suffered fates worse than death. First up in this category is a character we're all pretty reluctant to call a villain per se. Aggie Prenagast from Paranorman. Tragic backstories are a dime a dozen, but I gotta admit, it's hard to beat the story of someone who was literally murdered and got the opportunity to lash out from beyond the grave. It's hard to hate on Aggie despite the curse she laid on the town for centuries. If I were an 11-year-old girl accused of witchcraft and murdered just because I could talk to ghosts, I'd be pretty peeved too. Thankfully, Norman is able to finally talk her down and convince her to be at peace and lift the curse on the town. But while the ending of her story is happy, like, she's still dead, this is the story of an innocent little girl who was murdered by paranoid zealots and only found peace hundreds of years after her demise. All things considered, we can't blame her too much. Hailing from Rio, next up is Nigel, who I know probably seems like a very drastic tonal shift from the whole public child murder case we just covered. Everyone knows that the bird is the word, but few know which word the bird is, and that word for Nigel is revenge.
That's Shakespeare, by the way.
In the first movie, his attempts to get revenge on every pretty bird for stealing his celebrity status was foiled by Blue, who struggled with him in the final battle, left him injured and unable to fly, dooming Nigel to spend the rest of his days as a carnival fortune teller's assistant. Already, this is a pretty brutal punishment. Imagine being a bird, one of the most naturally free animals in existence, and having that gift of flight snuffed out while you watch the pretty birds fly around with glee. You can't help but feel for Nigel. Of course, then he goes and recruits several dangerous animals to work as his minions to try and kill his nemesis' family, and he loses all the already limited sympathy he had gotten from us. In the end, Nigel was taken back to Rio for observation by Dr. Tullio, and being the animal lover he is, we at least know Nigel is in good hands. But he's also in the presence of an obsessive love interest he does not reciprocate feelings for, so it's hard to say the stability is worth it. Just outside of our podium of brutality is the Dragon King from The Monkey King. Having been mistreated by humans as a result of his skin condition, Dragon King wanted to get his revenge by taking the world by storm. The storm in question being a great flood, and by taking the world, he basically meant killing everyone. Fortunately for us land dwellers, the Dragon King was taken down by the Monkey King before his plan could fully come to fruition. And by taken down, we mean taken down. Like from a gigantic dragon to a tiny lizard forced to scurry into the waters, still able to live on, but barely with even a fraction of the power he once held. He certainly won't be causing harm anymore unless he finds like a herd of amoebas to bully. I wouldn't put it past him. Like Nigel, the Dragon King has to live with the fact that he just lost all the power he held for years. And for him, it's on a way bigger scale. Taking home our bronze medal of evil, probably against its will too, Other Mother, aka the Beldam, is next. Not to be confused with Vivian's mean sister in Paper Mario, the Beldam is a malicious demon who lures unhappy children into her realm to ultimately sew buttons onto their eyes and keep them there as her food. That's not an exaggeration even. Once she convinces them to stay, she sucks out their life force and keeps their souls as prisoners for eternity, or at least she would have if not for Coraline and Wybie. There's basically no fate brutal enough for a creature like the Beldam, but this movie's final act came pretty close. When Coraline and Wybie crush the Other Mother's disembodied hand, they throw it into a well, covering it up for good, along with a particularly important key. You see, that key was the only way to open the door to the Beldam's world, which means she has no way of luring any more kids in to act as her nourishment. And considering she's already withering away when we last see her, it's safe to say this monster isn't going to be satisfying her hunger again. She's smart enough to lure countless children to their eternal doom, yet not smart enough to keep a spare key under her mat. Still, at least Other Mother might have some rest, since even most of the afterlife probably wouldn't want to mess with her. On the other hand, our silver medalist of evil, Lord Barkis Bittern, got a much more harrowing end. He was a man who lived up to his name. This gold digger is the one responsible for the titular corpse bride's death, killing her and making off with her family jewels, like actual jewels. He more than likely planned to repeat this process with Victoria to get even more money in those fattened up pockets of his. The guy was a scumbag and was arrogant enough to brag about the fact that he was about to get away with his crimes scot-free, since even the army of the undead right in front of him wasn't allowed to meddle in the affairs of the living. But his arrogance would be his undoing. See, during the wedding between Emily and Victor, the latter was supposed to drink a glass of the wine of ages, which would effectively kill him and allow him to be joined with Emily in the afterlife. Barkis, being the scoundrel he is, gave a sarcastic toast before enjoying that conveniently placed celebratory glass of wine, which not only turned him into a zombie, but handed him right over to the angry mob of undead who were ready to give him a very unpleasant stay in the underworld.
The right is all yours.
Barkis didn't just die. He died when he had a perfect opportunity to dodge consequences, then was essentially dragged into the abyss by monsters. But being even more of a monster himself, it's hard to imagine a more fitting end. That is, unless his death and afterlife were dealt with even more brutally. With that, we finally reach our gold medal of brutality, Rasputin. This guy is from Anastasia, which has to be the most Disney-coded, non-Disney movie I've ever seen, with a pretty sinister villain to boot. Rasputin was a traitorous advisor to the Romanovs, who was exiled from the kingdom after he was revealed to be trying to take over the kingdom from behind the scenes. As a result, he made a deal with the devil to kill the entire royal family, with the price for his newfound powers being his own flesh and blood. Unfortunately for him, Anastasia managed to escape with no memory of who she was, leaving Rasputin in a limbo state for 10 years as he processed his failure to kill a second grader despite having the power of the undead on his side. Being that bitter and having your body physically decomposing 24/7 for 10 years is already a pretty bad hand to be dealt, albeit one you dealt yourself. But in the final confrontation, Anastasia gives the guy an even rougher end. Thanks to Puka's interception, Anastasia is able to smash the source of Rasputin's demonic powers to pieces, causing the evil spirits to attack him all at once. The result is Rasputin's flesh literally melting off his body, followed by the violent convulsing and disintegration of his skeleton, resulting in his body basically getting Thanos out of existence. Jesus Christ. Now you might argue that even this brutal death was a pretty merciful end for Rasputin, but then you consider this guy had a debt to pay with the underworld, not unlike a certain con artist with friends on the other side. He might be in a different place right now, but it definitely isn't a better one. And while it may be a hot take, I think that if Anastasia were a Disney movie, he'd be taking the gold medal there as well.
Consider it a consolation prize for your failed family murder spree, Rasputin, you friggin' bastard. Good to hear your pet bat got a spinoff, though.